He walked onto the set with nothing but a wooden compass in his pocket. By the time the lights cut, Sylvester Stallone had been kicked off the show for daring to speak the truth no one else would. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The air in the green room crackled with a nervous energy that belied its plush, sound-dampened comforts. Elias Thorne sat in a low armchair, a still point in the pre-show swirl of publicists, makeup artists, and anxious production assistants. He held a small, well-worn book of poetry in his lap, its pages filled with the quiet wisdom of forgotten verses, though he wasn't reading. His gaze, calm and observant, was fixed on the flickering monitor that showed the live feed from the main stage, where tonight's host, a whirlwind of manicured charisma and practiced wit named Julian Vance, was warming up the studio audience. Julian's show, Vance Tonight, was a ratings behemoth, a nightly confection of celebrity interviews, comedic sketches, and carefully curated soundbites designed for maximum viral impact. It was a world away from Elias's own quiet existence, a life lived in the slow rhythms of his workshop, surrounded by the scent of old wood and the patient craft of restoring broken things. He was here, an unlikely guest, at the persistent invitation of a young, idealistic producer who had stumbled upon Elias's work with a local historical society, preserving the narratives of overlooked artisans and community elders. The producer had pitched him as a voice of authentic wisdom, a quaint counterpoint to the usual parade of fleeting fame. Elias had been hesitant, wary of the superficiality, the almost predatory nature of the spotlight. But a deeper obligation, a sense of duty to the stories he carried, had ultimately compelled him to accept. In his breast pocket, his fingers brushed against a small, intricately carved wooden compass, no bigger than a silver dollar. It didn't point north, not in the conventional sense. Its needle, crafted from a sliver of bone, was permanently fixed towards a single, unyielding direction, a symbolic true north of integrity, a reminder of a promise made long ago to always navigate by the stars of conscience, regardless of prevailing currents. He watched Julian Vance on the monitor, a master puppeteer of audience emotion, effortlessly eliciting laughter, applause, and adulation. Vance was known for his sharp intellect, his quick retorts, and a certain ruthless streak when it came to guests he deemed uninteresting or uncooperative. He could build someone up with a charming anecdote one moment, and then dismantle them with a cleverly veiled insult the next. Elias knew he was walking into a potential minefield. He had no witty sound bites prepared, no amusing personal stories to share. He had only the truth, unadorned and often uncomfortable. The producer, a young woman named Maya, with earnest eyes and a perpetually worried frown, fluttered by, offering him water, adjusting his microphone, her anxiety a palpable presence. "Remember, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, "just be yourself. But, keep it light." Julian likes light. Elias offered a faint, non-committal smile. Lightness was not his natural métier. His truths tended to have weight, substance. He glanced at the wooden compass in his mind's eye. Its needle remained steady. The call came, a brisk "Mr. Thorne, 5 minutes," from a headset-wearing stage manager. Elias rose, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He placed the book of poetry on the chair, a small anchor of quietude in the surrounding chaos. He felt the familiar pressure of the wooden compass against his chest. He was not a performer, not an entertainer. He was a witness, a keeper of stories, and he would speak his truth, whether it was deemed light enough for Julian Vance or not. The stage, he knew, could be a place of illusion, of manufactured reality. But it could also, if one held firm, be a place where a single, authentic voice could resonate with unexpected power. The challenge was to remain true to that inner compass, even when the bright lights threatened to blind and the roar of the crowd threatened to deafen. The transition from the hushed anticipation of the green room to the glaring reality of the Vance Tonight stage was abrupt, a sensory shock. Blinding lights, the roar of a live studio audience expertly whipped into a frenzy by Julian Vance's warm-up act, and the imposing presence of Vance himself, seated behind a sleek, modern desk, his smile a dazzling, predatory gleam. Elias Thorne walked onto this stage not with the practiced ease of a seasoned celebrity, but with the quiet, deliberate tread of a man accustomed to navigating more substantive terrains. He took his seat in the plush guest chair, a throne of temporary importance, and offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod to Vance. Elias Thorne, ladies and gentlemen. Vance boomed into his microphone, the audience responding with a wave of enthusiastic, if slightly bewildered, applause. They clearly didn't know who Elias was, but Vance's endorsement was enough. A master craftsman, a storyteller, a man who, I'm told, prefers the company of old wood to pretty much anything else. A ripple of laughter. Vance leaned forward, his eyes, sharp and assessing, fixing on Elias. So, Elias, he began, his tone a carefully calibrated blend of folksy charm and incisive wit. Tell us, in a world obsessed with the new, the shiny, the instantly gratifying, what's the appeal of spending your days with dusty old relics? The question, though framed as a light-hearted inquiry, carried an undeniable undercurrent of condescension. Elias met Francis Gay steadily. He didn't take the bait, didn't rise to the subtle provocation. There's a wisdom in old things, Julian, Elias replied, his voice calm, resonant, cutting through the studio's manufactured energy. A history. They carry the imprint of the hands that made them, the lives they've touched. They remind us that not everything of value is new, that some truths endure. Vance raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Enduring truths? That sounds a bit heavy for late-night television, Elias. We usually deal in enduring punchlines around here. More laughter from the audience, more pointed this time. Elias remained unfazed. Perhaps, he said, but punchlines, like new things, often fade quickly. Substance, however, has a way of lasting. The audience's laughter died down, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Vance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't going according to his usual script. Elias wasn't playing the game, wasn't offering up the easy sound bites, the self-deprecating humor that Vance so expertly exploited. Instead, he was offering sincerity. And sincerity on a show like Vance Tonight was a dangerous, unpredictable commodity. So, you restore old things, Vance pressed, trying new tack. Broken furniture, forgotten artifacts. Is there a metaphor in there somewhere, Elias? Are you trying to tell us that you, too, are a bit broken? A bit in need of restoration? The question was a classic Vance maneuver, a seemingly empathetic inquiry laced with a sharp, personal barb. Elias felt the sting, but his expression remained serene. He thought of the small wooden compass in his pocket. Its needle held true. We are all, in some way, broken, Julian, he said quietly. Life has a way of leaving its marks. The question is not whether we are broken, but how we choose to mend, what we choose to preserve, what we choose to carry forward. He paused, his gaze sweeping briefly over the studio audience, then returning to Vance. Some people choose to cover the cracks with a veneer of newness, of superficial perfection. Others choose to honor the breaks, to see them as part of a deeper, more authentic story. The silence in the studio was palpable. Vance's smile had vanished completely now, replaced by a look of carefully controlled annoyance. The interview was not unfolding as he had planned. Elias Thorne, the quiet craftsman, was proving to be a far more formidable and far less malleable guest than he had anticipated. The carefully constructed artifice of Vance Tonight was being subtly, yet persistently, challenged by a simple, unwavering authenticity. Julian Vance, accustomed to controlling the narrative, to guiding his guests through a carefully orchestrated dance of wit and revelation, found himself on unfamiliar ground. Elias Thorne was not playing by the established rules. He wasn't seeking approval, wasn't trying to be charming or amusing. He was simply being himself, speaking his truth with a quiet conviction that was both disarming and, to Vance, deeply irritating. So, Elias, Vance said, his voice taking on a sharper, more sarcastic edge, you're saying we should all embrace our brokenness? Wallow in our past imperfections? That sounds like a recipe for a pretty depressing society, not to mention a terrible talk show. He forced a laugh, and a few loyal audience members dutifully chuckled along, though the sound was hollow, lacking its usual conviction. Elias considered the question, his gaze steady. Embracing our imperfections is not about wallowing, Julian, he replied. It's about acknowledging our shared humanity. It's about understanding that true strength often comes not from an absence of flaws, but from the courage to face them, to learn from them, to integrate them into who we are. He gestured subtly towards the opulent, almost futuristic set of Vance tonight. This world you've created here, Julian, it's all about polished surfaces, isn't it? About projecting an image of effortless perfection. But what lies beneath that surface? What happens when the lights go off and the audience goes home? Vance shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was veering into territory he usually avoided, territory that was too real, too unscripted. He preferred the comfortable confines of carefully crafted banter, of easily digestible sound bites. We're here to entertain, Elias, Vance said, a note of defensiveness creeping into his voice. To provide an escape. People don't tune in to Vance tonight for a lecture on the human condition. Perhaps not a lecture, Elias conceded. But perhaps they are hungry for something more than just an escape. Perhaps they're yearning for a little authenticity, a little substance, in a world that often feels increasingly superficial. He leaned forward slightly, his quiet intensity filling the space between them. You have a powerful platform, Julian. A voice that reaches millions. Do you ever feel a responsibility to use that voice for something more than just entertainment? The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Vance's carefully cultivated persona. Vance looked momentarily stunned, as if no guest had ever dared to question his methods, his purpose, so directly. He opened his mouth to deliver a witty retort, a dismissive quip, but for once, the words seemed to fail him. He saw a flicker of something in Elias's eyes, not judgment, but a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. It was the look of a man who had seen through the facade, who recognized the emptiness that often lay beneath the glittering surface of fame and fortune. The studio audience was silent now, their earlier amusement replaced by a rapt, almost uncomfortable attention. They were witnessing something unexpected, something unscripted, a genuine clash of values, a quiet battle for the soul of the show itself. The producer, Maya, watching from the wings, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This was not going at all as planned, but a small, rebellious part of her also felt a thrill, a sense of vindication. Elias Thorne, the quiet man of wood and wisdom, was holding his own, and in doing so, he was exposing the hollowness at the heart of the very machine that had invited him. The wooden compass in Elias's pocket seemed to press against his chest, a silent affirmation. He was on course. Julian Vance, momentarily disarmed, quickly rallied, his professional instincts kicking in. He couldn't let this quiet, unassuming craftsman derail his show, couldn't allow his authority to be so openly challenged. He decided to go on the offensive, to use the tools he knew best, ridicule, sarcasm, and the power of the public platform. Responsibility? Vance scoffed, forcing a derisive laugh. My responsibility, Elias, is to my network, to my sponsors, and to the millions of people who tune in every night expecting to be entertained, not lectured by some homespun philosopher who thinks he has all the answers because he whittles wood for a living. The insult was deliberate, designed to wound, to diminish. A nervous titter ran through the audience, unsure how to react. Elias absorbed the verbal blow without flinching, his expression unchanging. I don't claim to have all the answers, Julian, he said, his voice still calm, still measured. I only offer observations. And one observation is that a platform as large as yours carries with it a certain weight. A potential to influence, to shape perspectives. To dismiss that as mere entertainment seems a missed opportunity. Perhaps even a dereliction. Dereliction. Vance's voice rose, his face flushing. Now you're accusing me of dereliction of duty? Because I don't turn my comedy show into a therapy session for the existentially troubled. He turned to the audience, seeking their support, their laughter. What do you think, folks? Should Vance Tonight become Elias Thorne's somber reflections hour? A few scattered, uncomfortable laughs. Most of the audience remained silent, their expressions reflecting a growing unease with Vance's increasingly aggressive tone. They had come for entertainment, yes, but not for a public humiliation. Elias watched Vance, a profound sadness in his eyes. He saw not a powerful media personality, but a man trapped by his own image, a man whose fear of vulnerability, of genuine human connection, was manifesting as anger and aggression. It's not about turning your show into something it's not, Julian, Elias said gently. It's about recognizing that even within entertainment, there can be space for truth, for empathy, for a moment of genuine reflection. It's not an either/, or proposition. He paused, then added, his voice dropping slightly, unless, of course, one is afraid of what such reflection might reveal. That landed. Vance recoiled as if struck. The implication was clear, and it hit too close to home. His carefully constructed facade of effortless confidence, of witty detachment, was beginning to crack. He looked flustered, angry, and for the first time, genuinely vulnerable. Maya, the producer, watching from backstage, felt her heart pound. This was escalating beyond anything she could have imagined. She saw a senior producer speaking urgently into a headset, probably ordering them to cut to a commercial. But before that could happen, Vance, driven by a desperate need to regain control, to reassert his dominance, made his move. "You know what, Elias?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I think our audience has had quite enough of your profound insights for one evening. Perhaps it's time you went back to your workshop and your dusty old relics. They're clearly more appreciative of your particular brand of wisdom than we are." He pressed a button on his desk. "We'll be right back after this break, folks, with someone a little more entertaining." The house band struck up a loud, jarring chord. The applause sign flashed. But the applause from the audience was hesitant, scattered, almost reluctant. Many of them looked uncomfortable, even angry, at Vance's dismissive, disrespectful treatment of his guest. Elias Thorne sat still in his chair for a moment, the cacophony of the forced commercial break swirling around him. He had been publicly dismissed, essentially kicked off the show. Yet his expression remained calm, his dignity intact. He had spoken his truth. He had not compromised his integrity. And in the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over much of the audience, he sensed that his words, despite Vance's attempts to ridicule them, had found their mark. The small wooden compass in his pocket felt like a steady, reassuring presence. He had navigated by its true north, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. As the jarring theme music for Vance Tonight blared and the studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, Elias Thorne rose slowly from the guest chair. There was no anger in his movements, no sign of humiliation, only a quiet, resolute dignity. He knew he would not be invited back after the break. Julian Vance had made that abundantly and rudely clear. Several stagehands, looking awkward and apologetic, began to move towards him, presumably to escort him off the stage. But Elias needed no escort. He walked with his own steady, unhurried pace towards the wings, his back straight, his head held high. Maya, the young producer, met him there, her face a mask of distress and mortification. "Mr. Thorne," she stammered, "I am so sorry. I had no idea Julian would. I mean, he can be difficult, but this was unconscionable." Elias offered her a faint, reassuring smile. "It's not your fault, Maya," he said gently. "You invited me in good faith. Some environments, it seems, are simply not conducive to certain kinds of conversation. But he was so rude, so disrespectful," Maya exclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. "He didn't even let you finish. He just cut you off." "Some truths, Maya," Elias observed, "are difficult for people to hear, especially when those truths challenge their own carefully constructed realities." He paused, then added, Julian Vance is a man who has built his success on a certain kind of performance. My presence, my words, threatened that performance. His reaction, though unfortunate, was perhaps predictable. Maya looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and concern. "But what about you, Mr. Thorne? Are you all right?" Elias considered the question. All right? He had been publicly insulted, dismissed on national television. Yet, strangely, he did not feel defeated. He felt calm, almost serene. "I am as I am, Maya," he said. "I spoke what I believe to be true. The reception of that truth is beyond my control." He reached into his pocket and took out the small wooden compass. He held it in his palm for a moment, its smooth, familiar contours a silent affirmation. "This," he said, showing it to Maya, "is my guide. As long as I follow its direction, I am all right." Maya stared at the compass, a puzzled expression on her face. It was clearly not a functional navigational tool. "It points to integrity, Maya," Elias explained softly. "To authenticity, to staying true to one's own core values, regardless of the storms or the applause." Just then, a senior network executive, a stern-faced woman in a power suit, hurried towards them, her expression one of controlled fury. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clipped, "a word, if you please." "In my office." Elias knew this was not an invitation, but a summons. He glanced at Maya, then back at the executive. "Of course," he said, his tone polite, unwavering. He had faced Julian Vance's public bluster. He was not about to be intimidated by a network executive's private displeasure. He had navigated by his compass this far. He would continue to do so, wherever the path might lead. The real show, it seemed, was only just beginning. The network executive's office was predictably opulent, a glass-walled eyrie overlooking the glittering cityscape. It was designed to impress, to intimidate. Ms. Devereaux, as she introduced herself, gestured Elias to a leather chair that felt more like a throne of judgment than a comfortable seat. She remained standing, pacing behind her large, uncluttered desk, a lioness in her cage. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice low and dangerous. "What happened out there tonight was unacceptable. Julian Vance is the cornerstone of this network's primetime lineup. His show generates millions in revenue. We do not appreciate guests who antagonize him, who derail his carefully crafted segments, who, frankly, make him look bad." Elias listened calmly, his hands resting lightly on his knees. He did not fidget, did not look away. He simply met Ms. Devereaux's icy gaze with his own steady, unblinking stare. "My intention was not to antagonize Mr. Vance, Ms. Devereaux," Elias replied, his voice even, respectful. "Nor was it to derail his show. I was invited to share my perspective. I did so, honestly and respectfully, to the best of my ability." "Honestly," Ms. Devereaux scoffed. "You were confrontational, Mr. Thorne. You were preachy. You turned a light entertainment segment into some kind of philosophical interrogation. Our audience tunes in for laughs, for celebrity gossip, not for unsolicited life lessons from a man who carves wooden birds." Elias felt a familiar stirring at the dismissive reference to his craft, but he let it pass. "The object I carry is a compass, Ms. Devereaux, not a bird," he corrected gently, "and it guides me towards speaking truth, even when that truth might be uncomfortable for some." "Uncomfortable?" Ms. Devereaux's voice rose. "It was a disaster. Julian is furious. The sponsors are nervous. The switchboard is lighting up with mixed reactions, to put it mildly." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Mixed reactions? So, not everyone found my observations unwelcome." Ms. Devereaux waved a dismissive hand. "That's not the point. The point is, you were a disruptive element. You did not play by the rules. You did not give Julian what he wanted, what he expected." "And what was that, Ms. Devereaux?" Elias asked. "Polite deference? Amusing anecdotes? A willing participation in the superficiality that seems to be the currency of this particular realm?" He leaned forward slightly, his quiet intensity filling the room. "I was invited, I believe, because someone thought I might offer a different perspective. A moment of authenticity in an often artificial world. If that authenticity proved disruptive, then perhaps that says more about the world than it does about me. Ms. Devereaux stopped her pacing, her eyes narrowing. She was clearly not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone she considered so far beneath her in the media hierarchy. "You are an arrogant man, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice laced with venom. "You come in here, a nobody, and you presume to lecture us on our responsibilities, on the nature of our business." "I presume nothing, Ms. Devereaux," Elias countered. "I simply observe, and I speak what I see. If that is perceived as arrogance, then so be it." He paused, then added, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "But perhaps, just perhaps, your audience, and even Mr. Vance himself, might be yearning for something more than what they are currently being offered. Perhaps a little less gloss and a little more substance." He stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. "I will take my leave now, Ms. Devereaux. I have said what I came to say. I regret any inconvenience my presence may have caused." He turned to walk towards the door. "Don't think this is over, Thorne," Ms. Devereaux snapped, her voice sharp with impotent fury. "You'll hear from our legal department. There are clauses in the guest agreement, reputational damage." Elias paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He turned back to face her, a faint, almost sorrowful smile touching his lips. "Reputation, Ms. Devereaux," he said quietly, "is what others think you are. Character is what you truly are. I am content with my character. Are you content with yours?" And with that, he opened the door and walked out, leaving Ms. Devereaux speechless, her face a mask of sputtering rage, alone in her glass-walled fortress with the uncomfortable echo of his final question. The wooden compass in his pocket felt warm, its needle pointing true. The aftermath of Elias Thorne's appearance on Vance Tonight was, as Ms. Devereaux had predicted, tumultuous, though perhaps not in the way she had entirely anticipated. The network, in an attempt at damage control, issued a carefully worded statement about creative differences and a regrettable on-air misunderstanding. Julian Vance, on his next show, made a few snide, dismissive remarks about self-important windbags and guests who mistake a talk show for a pulpit, but his usual aggressive wit seemed blunted, his confidence slightly shaken. The legal threats from the network never materialized. Perhaps their lawyers advised them that suing a quiet, unassuming craftsman for reputational damage after he had been publicly insulted and dismissed by their star host would be a public relations disaster. Or perhaps, somewhere deep within the corporate machinery, a flicker of conscience, or at least a pragmatic caution, had been ignited. But the real story was unfolding elsewhere, in the digital town square of social media, in online forums, in conversations around water coolers and dinner tables. The segment, despite the network's attempts to downplay it, had gone viral. Clips of the fiery exchange between Elias and Julian, particularly Elias's quiet, principled responses to Vance's escalating aggression, were shared and reshared thousands of times. The hashtag Elias Thorne Speaks Truth began trending. People were not, it turned out, universally in agreement with Vance's assessment of Elias as a bore or a preachy philosopher. Many viewers, it seemed, had been deeply moved by Elias's quiet dignity, his unwavering integrity, his gentle but firm refusal to be cowed or ridiculed. They found his call for authenticity, for substance over superficiality, to be a refreshing antidote to the often toxic brew of celebrity culture and manufactured outrage. Comments flooded in. "Finally, someone on television who isn't afraid to speak from the heart. Elias Thorne is the hero we didn't know we needed. Julian Vance showed his true colors tonight, and they weren't pretty. I'm buying whatever that wooden compass guy is selling, as long as it's integrity." Of course, there were detractors too, those who defended Vance, who found Elias pompous or out of touch. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of admiration for the quiet craftsman who had dared to challenge the king of late-night television on his own turf, and who had, in the eyes of many, emerged victorious, not by outshouting his opponent, but by staying true to his own moral compass. Maya, the young producer who had invited Elias, found herself in a precarious position. She was initially reprimanded by Ms. Devereaux for her poor judgment in booking such a controversial guest. But as the public tide turned in Elias's favor, and as network executives began to see the unexpected positive buzz generated by the Elias Thorne incident, Maya's stock began to rise. She had, inadvertently, stumbled upon a cultural moment, a hunger for authenticity that the network had failed to recognize. Elias himself remained largely oblivious to the online furor. He had no social media accounts, no interest in the fleeting fame or infamy of the digital age. He returned to his workshop, to the familiar scent of wood and varnish, to the patient, meditative rhythm of his craft. He continued to restore broken things, to find the beauty in forgotten objects, to live his life according to the quiet wisdom of his own inner compass. He received a few letters, forwarded by Maya, from people who had been touched by his words, who shared his concerns about the superficiality of modern culture, who thanked him for his courage. He read them with a quiet sense of gratitude, but he sought no further engagement with the world of media or public opinion. His work was elsewhere. A few weeks after the infamous Vance Tonight episode, Elias received an unexpected visitor at his workshop. It was Julian Vance. He looked different without the studio lights, the expensive suit, the mask of professional charisma. He looked tired, smaller, almost vulnerable. He carried no entourage, no air of celebrity. He was just a man, standing awkwardly in the doorway of Elias's dusty, quiet sanctuary. "Mr. Thorne," Vance began, his voice hesitant, stripped of its usual confident bluster. "May I come in for a moment?" Elias, surprised but not unwelcoming, gestured towards a worn wooden stool. "Julian, please." Vance sat, looking around the workshop with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The tools, the half-finished projects, the scent of wood and time. It was a world entirely alien to him. I wanted to apologize," Vance said, his gaze fixed on the floor, "for my behavior on the show. It was unprofessional, uncalled for. I was a jerk." The admission seemed to cost him a great deal. Elias listened, his expression calm, non-judgmental. "I understand you were defending your territory, Julian," Elias said quietly. "My presence, my words, were perhaps unexpected." "Unexpected?" Vance gave a short, humorless laugh. "They were like a bomb going off in my carefully constructed little world. You made me look at things I didn't want to see. About myself. About the show. About everything." He looked up then, his eyes holding a raw honesty Elias hadn't seen on the television screen. "The thing is, Thorne, you were right. About a lot of it. This business, it can hollow you out if you let it. You start believing your own hype, your own performance." He paused, then added, his voice barely a whisper, "I haven't felt authentic in a very long time." Elias nodded slowly. He understood. He had seen it many times, the corrosive effect of fame, the way it could warp a person's soul, leaving them rich in possessions but impoverished in spirit. "Authenticity is a difficult path to maintain, Julian," Elias said gently, "especially when the world rewards artifice." "But you do it," Vance said, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "That compass you talked about, is that real?" Elias reached into his pocket and took out the small wooden compass. He placed it on the workbench between them. "It's real to me, Julian," he said. "It reminds me of my true north, of the values that matter most. Integrity, honesty, compassion." Vance stared at the compass, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of city traffic and the gentle ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner of the workshop. "I don't know if I can change, Thorne," Vance said finally, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "I'm too old, too set in my ways. This machine, it has me. It's never too late to choose a different path, Julian," Elias said, "to recalibrate your own compass. The first step is simply to acknowledge that you've lost your way." He offered the wooden compass to Vance. Perhaps this might help you find your bearings." Vance looked at the compass, then at Elias, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of gratitude, doubt, and a dawning, fragile hope. He hesitated, then slowly, tentatively, reached out and took it. Its smooth, worn wood felt surprisingly warm in his hand. The visit from Julian Vance was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new, unexpected chapter. Vance didn't undergo a miraculous, overnight transformation. The machinery of late-night television, the demands of ratings and sponsors, were still powerful forces. But something had shifted within him, a seed of doubt, a flicker of yearning for something more authentic. He began to experiment, tentatively at first, with small changes to his show. He occasionally invited guests who were less about celebrity and more about substance. He allowed for moments of quieter, more reflective conversation, even if they didn't always land with a punchline. He even, on one memorable occasion, spoke openly about his own struggles with the pressures of fame, a moment of vulnerability that resonated deeply with his audience. The network executives were initially nervous, but the ratings surprisingly held steady and in some demographics even improved. It seemed Elias Thorne had been right. People were indeed hungry for a little more substance, a little less gloss. As for Elias, he continued his quiet life, his work in the workshop a steady, grounding rhythm. He never sought out further public attention, politely declining the numerous interview requests that came his way after the Vance Tonight episode. His purpose had never been fame, but truth. He occasionally heard from Maya, the young producer, who kept him updated on the subtle but significant changes happening on the show, and in Julian Vance himself. She told him that Vance kept the small wooden compass on his desk, a quiet reminder of a conversation that had, in its own way, changed his life. Elias never asked for the compass back. He knew it was where it needed to be. He could always carve another, if he felt the need. The true compass, after all, was within. One afternoon, a package arrived at Elias's workshop. It was from Julian Vance. Inside, there was no letter, only a beautifully crafted, antique sextant, its brass gleaming, its lenses clear. Tucked beside it was a small, handwritten card. It read simply, "For helping me find my stars." Yot fau. Elias smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. He placed the sextant on his workbench, near his own collection of well-loved tools. It was a symbol, he knew, not of a destination reached, but of a journey begun. A journey towards authenticity, towards a true north that, however difficult to navigate, was always worth seeking. The fires of their on-air clash had, in the end, forged an unlikely connection, a quiet understanding between two men from vastly different worlds. And in that, Elias Thorne found a profound, if unexpected, sense of hope. The world, perhaps, was not entirely lost to superficiality. There were still souls, even in the brightest, most distracting spotlights, who yearned for the steady, quiet guidance of an inner compass. And sometimes, all it took was a single, unwavering voice speaking truth to help them find it. Elias Thorne often thought back to that fiery clash on Vance Tonight, not with any sense of triumph over Julian Vance, but with a quiet contemplation of the unpredictable ways in which truth can ripple outwards. His workshop remained his sanctuary, the scent of cedar and lemon oil a constant comfort. The antique sextant Julian had sent him occupied a place of honor on a high shelf, a gleaming reminder of an unlikely bridge built between two disparate worlds. He knew that the compass he had given Julian was merely a symbol. The real work of navigating by one's own integrity was a daily, often arduous, internal process. He hoped Julian was finding his way, one deliberate degree at a time. Elias himself continued to live by the unwavering needle of his own inner compass. He took on projects that had meaning, restoring not just the physical forms of broken objects, but sometimes, in a small way, the broken spirits of those who brought them to him. He listened more than he spoke, his quiet presence often a greater solace than any words could offer. He still carried a small, hand-carved piece of wood in his pocket, though it was no longer the bone-needled compass. That had served its purpose with Julian. Now, it was a simple, unadorned piece of dark, resilient ironwood, smooth and heavy, a reminder of the enduring strength found in quiet steadfastness. Maya, the young producer, became an occasional visitor to his workshop. She would bring him news of the television world, of Julian's ongoing, sometimes faltering, attempts to inject more authenticity into his show. She told him that hashtag Elias Thornspeak's truth still surfaced occasionally online, a testament to the lasting impact of his brief, tumultuous foray into the spotlight. She confessed that his courage that night had inspired her to push for more meaningful content, to champion voices that were often overlooked. "You showed us there's an audience for depth, Mr. Thorne," she'd said once, her eyes shining. Even in the shallow end, Elias would simply nod, offering her a cup of tea, his workshop a quiet refuge from the relentless demands of her profession. He knew that the battle between substance and superficiality was an ongoing one, in the media and in the wider world. He had fought one small skirmish, and perhaps had nudged the needle ever so slightly towards a more authentic true north. He never expected to change the world. His focus was always smaller, more intimate, to mend what was broken, to honor what was true, to live a life of quiet integrity. And in the steady, patient work of his hands, in the wisdom he gleaned from old wood and forgotten stories, he found his own enduring peace. The lights of the television studio were a distant memory, but the quiet conviction that had guided him on that stage remained, a steadfast internal compass, always pointing towards the unyielding true north of his soul. And that, he knew, was a guidance more valuable than any fleeting fame or public applause.